All right, welcome back to Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. And just like that, week two's in the books. And what's the first thing we have to do fantasy wise? Waiver wire claims. I'm going to talk about who you should be targeting this week. Let's go. All right, let's talk about some of the quarterbacks on my waiver wire list for the week. And that first quarterback, Detroit Lions quarterback Jared Goff. Now, after a rough week one start, Goff's still available in a lot of leagues. And in week two, he only had 5 incompletions, which matched his 5 touchdown passes. The Lions should have a top 5 offense, and all that should go through Goff. And after showing what he can do last year with a top 10 fantasy finish, you should try and snag Goff if you can. Another quarterback you should be targeting on the waiver wire this week, Indianapolis Colts quarterback Daniel Jones. Jones was efficient again this week, taking what the defense gave him. And through 2 weeks, he's averaging 294 passing yards a game, completing almost 72% of his passes, and going for 2.5 total touchdowns a game. And with all the injuries to the quarterback position, Jones might pull a fantasy Tom Brady and come into your starting position and win you a fantasy championship. All right, and the last quarterback on my waiver wire target list for this week, New York Giants quarterback Russell Wilson. Wilson was making ramen in week 1, but he was back to cooking like the Russ we know in week 2, passing for a ridiculous 450 yards and 3 touchdowns, while completing 73.2% of his passes. Now, the only question fantasy GMs have to ask is, are you getting the Chef Boyardee Russ from week 1 or the Chef Gusteau Russ from week 2? The first running back you should target on the waiver wire this week, Cleveland Browns running back Quinshon Judkins. Judkins had 10 carries for 61 yards and 3 catches on 3 targets last week. And that's with dealing with all the off-the-field stuff. But now that's behind him and he'll be able to focus on football, where I think he'll be the focus of the Cleveland Browns offense, with last week's waiver wire darling Dylan Sampson more of a change of pace back. The next running back you should target on the waiver wire this week, New York Giants running back Cam Skattebo. After a rough week 1 against the Commanders, Skattebo had a bounce-back game against the Cowboys, rushing 11 times for 45 yards and a touchdown, and catching 2 passes for 14 yards. Skattebo's 13 touches led the team and was 4 more than Tyrone Tracy Jr. The last running back on my waiver wire target list for the week, Jacksonville Jaguars running back Bashal Tutin. After only 3 carries in week 1, Tutin was much more involved in the offense in week 2, with 8 carries for 42 yards and 2 catches for 32 yards and 1 touchdown. All right, the first wide receiver on my waiver wire list for this week, Los Angeles Chargers wide receiver Quentin Johnson. All right, maybe week 1 wasn't a fluke and Johnson's going to be heavily involved in the offense. Either way, Johnson's averaging 7 targets, 4 catches, 75 yards, and over 1 touchdown a game. And those are the type of numbers that can't be sitting out on the waiver wire. So at the very least, somebody snag him and put him on your damn bench. The next wide receiver on my waiver wire list for the week, New York Giants wide receiver Wan'Dale Robinson. Robinson had a big week 2 with 8 catches, 142 yards, and a touchdown. And through 2 weeks, he's averaging 9 targets, 7 catches, and almost 100 yards a game. And with Malik Neighbors on the other side continually drawing double coverage, and those type of numbers, Robinson's more than worth an ad at this point. The next wide receiver you should be targeting on the waiver wire this week, Jacksonville Jaguars wide receiver Diami Brown. Now, he's clearly the number 3 in the offense, but he continues to convert his chances, hauling in 5 catches for 57 yards and a touchdown against the Bengals on Sunday. And he's now averaging 4 catches for 55 yards on 6 targets per game. And if anything happens to Brian Thomas or Travis Hunter, he's going to step into a more prominent role, and he's worth an add to your roster this week. The next wide receiver you should target on the waiver wire this week, Tennessee Titans wide receiver Alec Eomanor. Eomanor was on my waiver wire target list last week, and that was prior to his 4-catch, 56-yard, 1 touchdown game in week 2. And his 28% target share is currently top 15 in the league. So hopefully you were able to snag him last week. If not, grab him while you still can. All right, the last wide receiver I wanted to highlight from the waiver wire list this week, Carolina Panthers wide receiver Hunter Renfrow. No, it's not 2021, but Renfrow's having a slight resurgence in Carolina this season, catching 2 touchdown passes in the first 2 weeks of the season. He's also got 15 targets in the first 2 weeks of the season, and as long as he keeps converting those chances, he might be worth a look for your roster in deeper leagues. The first tight end I'd target on the waiver wire this week, Washington Commanders tight end Zach Ertz. Now, I'm not going to lie, I thought last year was a 1-year resurgence for the tight end in Washington, but through 2 weeks, he has a ridiculous 17.2 target share percentage for 90 catches, 90 yards, and 2 touchdowns, leading the Commanders in every major receiving category. And with no signs of slowing down this season, if you can snag Ertz, do it now. The next tight end you should be targeting on the waiver wire this week, a guy that was on my waiver wire list from last week, Cleveland Browns tight end Harold Fannin Jr. Now, through 2 weeks, Fannin Jr. is averaging 7 targets, 6 catches, and 55 yards a game. Now, while the Browns offense might not be the best, if you're in a PPR league, his average alone is going to get you almost 12 points a week. And if you're in a deeper league, he's worth an ad this week for sure. All right, the last tight end and last player on my waiver wire list for this week, Carolina Panthers tight end Jatavion Sanders. Now, Sanders turned his 9 targets in week 2 into 7 catches for 54 yards. And while you might not expect 9 targets every week, he's produced with a target share of less than 9%. So it's not crazy to think those numbers could go up during the season. So he's definitely worth, as I always say, an add in deeper leagues. All right, that'll do it for the Fantasy Bankroll waiver wire list. Thank you so much for checking it out. I'll be back in a few days with my stock report and my BB list. Don't forget to get those waiver wire claims in. Let's go.